I was standing at my desk, staring at an email that had arrived at 11:47 p.m. the night before. Subject line, task reassignment effective immediately. My hands weren't shaking. My breath was steady. But something inside me had already made a decision that my conscious mind was only beginning to understand. "You care too much about accuracy," he'd joked 3 days earlier, right before reassigning the quality control protocols I'd spent 18 months building. I'd said nothing then. I was saying nothing now. But I was already booking a flight home to see my parents, not for comfort, but to retrieve something I'd stored in their basement years ago. Every single document, every email thread, every revised procedure that showed exactly how much this company had relied on my excessive attention to detail. My name is Sharon Homes. I'm 34 years old, and for the past 6 years, I've been the senior quality assurance architect at Bayside Technologies, a mid-sized logistics software company based in Portland. When I say I built the quality control system from the ground up, I mean I designed every checkpoint, every validation rule, every error-catching mechanism that kept our software from sending 18-wheelers to the wrong distribution centers or miscalculating freight costs by factors of 10. Before I arrived, Bayside had a 23% error rate in their shipping algorithms. Within my first year, I'd brought that down to 0.4%. By year 3, we were at 0.08%, industry-leading, award-winning precision that our sales team used as their primary selling point. I didn't just check boxes. I understood the cascading consequences of every data point in our system. A misplaced decimal in a weight calculation could mean a truck loaded beyond legal limits, resulting in fines, accidents, or worse. A time zone error could delay medical supplies by 12 hours. My job wasn't about perfectionism for its own sake, it was about preventing disasters that cost money, endangered lives, and destroyed reputations. Every major client contract included specific performance guarantees that I'd personally architected into our quality metrics. When Fortune 500 companies signed with Bayside, they were signing because of numbers I could prove, systems I maintained, and protocols I enforced without exception. The company knew this. Everyone from the CEO down to the newest developer knew that Sharon Homes was the reason we could promise what we promised. They also knew that I controlled something far more valuable than just the quality process. I controlled the knowledge of how that process actually worked. The documentation existed, yes, but understanding how to interpret it, how to implement it correctly, how to troubleshoot when something went sideways. That lived in my head, in my decision-making patterns, in 6 years of solving problems no one else had seen coming. Then came Garrett Stevenson. He arrived in February as our new director of operations, hired from outside the company with a mandate to streamline processes and reduce operational overhead. Garrett was 42, silver-haired, fond of using military metaphors in meetings despite never having served, and absolutely convinced that most corporate processes were bloated wastes of time created by people protecting their own jobs. He'd made his reputation at his previous company by cutting staff and consolidating roles, boosting their short-term profit margins by 18% over 2 quarters. What the board apparently hadn't noticed was that his previous company's client retention rate had dropped by 31% in the following year, and he'd left right before the lawsuits started. Our first meeting was in early March. He'd called me into his office, not a conference room, his office, a power move I noted but didn't react to, and spread a printout of my department's budget across his desk. "Sharon, help me understand something," he said, leaning back in his chair with his hands behind his head. "You've got 2 full-time QA engineers reporting to you, plus you're pulling in contractor hours for testing cycles. That's a lot of payroll for what is essentially a checking function." I kept my voice level. Quality assurance isn't a checking function. It's a prevention system. Those engineers handle different aspects of the validation pipeline, real-time transaction monitoring, batch processing audits, and integration testing with client systems. The contractors come in during major releases because we need surge capacity to test every edge case before deployment. He waved a hand dismissively. Sure. But what's the actual cost if we miss something small? We fix it in a patch, clients understand that software has bugs. Isn't this a bit like hiring 10 lifeguards for a kiddie pool? I pulled up the incident log on my tablet and turned it to face him. Last November, we caught a rounding error in the fuel cost calculator 3 hours before a major release. If that had gone live, it would have undercharged our 3 largest clients by approximately $42,000 per day, accumulated across their combined transaction volume. Our contract terms don't allow us to retroactively bill for calculation errors. We'd have eaten those losses until the next release cycle. That's $1.7 million prevented by a system you're calling excessive. Garrett barely glanced at the screen. Right, but that's one incident. Cherry-picking the dramatic saves doesn't prove we need this level of investment ongoing. That's when I knew. Not suspected, knew. He'd already decided to cut my budget. This meeting was theater, a chance for him to say he'd consulted with me before doing exactly what he planned to do anyway. Over the next 6 weeks, I watched him work. He'd schedule meetings with my team members individually, asking them to help him understand their roles, taking notes on his laptop with a concerned expression that suggested he was deeply invested in operational excellence. What he was actually doing was building a case for consolidation, looking for any task that could theoretically be absorbed into another department's responsibilities. He'd forward me his notes afterward, framed as collaborative thinking, but really as warnings that change was coming whether I cooperated or not. The engineers on my team started coming to me nervously. He asked me if I thought the automated tests really needed manual review, one said. He wanted to know if we could just rely on the automation and spot-check failures. I told them the truth, automation catches known patterns, but manual review catches the things we didn't know to test for. I told them about the time a vendor changed their API response format without warning, and our automated tests passed because they were checking for errors in the old format, not absence of expected data in a new format. A human reviewer caught it because something looked off. That human review process took maybe 4 hours per week. The cost of missing that issue would have been 3 weeks of corrupted shipping data across 87 clients. But Garrett didn't want to hear those stories. He wanted efficiency metrics that fit on a slide deck. The reassignment email came on a Tuesday night in mid-April. I'd stayed late finishing a compliance audit for a potential new client in the pharmaceutical logistics space, highly regulated, zero error tolerance, the kind of client that would double our revenue if we landed them. I was thorough because thoroughness was how we won contracts like this. I sent the audit report at 10:15 p.m. and headed home. The email arrived while I was asleep. When I opened it the next morning, I had to read it 3 times to believe what I was seeing. Effective immediately, quality assurance protocols for release cycles will be managed by the development operations team under Ian Coslow's supervision. This consolidation eliminates redundant oversight and accelerates our deployment timeline. Sharon, you'll transition to a strategic advisory role, focusing on documentation and process improvement recommendations. Please coordinate handoff with Ian by end of week. No meeting. No discussion. Just a unilateral decision that stripped me of the operational control I'd built my entire role around, reassigning it to a DevOps manager who was excellent at maintaining servers and deployment pipelines but had zero background in quality methodology or error analysis. I walked into work that morning and went straight to Garrett's office. He was on a phone call but waved me in, holding up one finger in a just a minute gesture that stretched into 5 minutes while I stood there. When he finally hung up, he smiled like we were old friends. Sharon. I figured you'd want to chat about the reorganization. Look, I know change is uncomfortable, but this is really an opportunity for you to step back from the day-to-day grind and think more strategically about how we approach quality across the whole organization. You'll be able to. Where's the risk assessment? I interrupted. He blinked. The what? The risk assessment for this change. Client contracts include specific quality guarantees tied to our current protocols. Did you review which contracts include penalty clauses for errors above threshold? Did you assess Ian's team's capacity to absorb this workload on top of their existing responsibilities? Did you consult with legal about liability implications? Garrett's smile hardened. Sharon, this is exactly the kind of overthinking I'm trying to move us away from. We're a software company, not a nuclear power plant. You care too much about accuracy for every tiny decision. Sometimes good enough is good enough, and we need to move fast to stay competitive. He said it like a joke, like we were buddies and he was ribbing me about a harmless quirk. But his eyes were calculating, measuring whether I was going to fight this or fall in line. I said nothing. I turned around and walked out of his office, back to my desk, where I opened my calendar and booked a flight to Sacramento for that evening. My parents still lived in the house I grew up in, and their basement still contained 3 file boxes I'd stored there when I moved to Portland. Inside those boxes was something most people would consider excessive: printed copies of every major document I'd created in my first 4 years at Bayside, before everything went fully digital. Procedure manuals, incident reports, cost-benefit analyses, client correspondence, meeting notes where I'd warned against specific decisions that later proved disastrous. I'd kept them partly out of habit. I'd always been someone who documented everything, and partly out of instinct that someday, somehow, this paper trail might matter. I spent that evening in my parents' basement, going through those boxes systematically, photographing each page with my phone. Then I spent the next day pulling digital records from my personal backup drives, emails I'd forwarded to my personal account over the years, design documents I'd worked on from home, version histories showing exactly who had contributed what to various systems. I wasn't stealing company property. I was gathering evidence of my own work, my own expertise, and my own repeated warnings about what would happen if quality controls were weakened. By the time I flew back to Portland on Friday morning, I had 1,800 pages of documentation organized into a timeline that showed a very clear pattern. Every time someone had tried to shortcut quality processes over the past 6 years, I had objected in writing, explained the specific risks, and either convinced them to reconsider or been overruled. And in every single case where I'd been overruled, the exact problems I'd predicted had materialized within weeks, costing the company money and credibility. I also had something else: the master access credentials to the quality monitoring dashboard I'd designed. It was technically a company system, but I'd built it on a framework I'd purchased with my own credit card during the early days when the company was too cheap to buy proper tools. The licensing agreement was in my name. The admin panel answered to me. And while the system fed data into Bayside's infrastructure, the core control mechanisms lived in an environment I owned. When I arrived at the office Friday morning, I didn't mention the trip. I coordinated the handoff meeting with Ian as requested. He was a good person, competent in his domain, and visibly uncomfortable with the situation. "Sharon, I want you to know I didn't ask for this," he said. "Garrett just told me it was happening." "I know," I said. "It's not your fault. We spent 3 hours going over the protocols." I showed him the dashboard, walked him through the standard procedures, explained the alert systems. I was professional, thorough, and completely unhelpful in the way that mattered most. I explained what the tools did, but not why they were designed that way. I showed him where to look for problems, but not how to interpret what he was seeing. I gave him a map of the territory without teaching him the language. It was like handing someone the controls to a passenger jet and saying, "This makes it go up, this makes it turn, good luck." Ian didn't notice because he didn't yet know what he didn't know. Garrett didn't notice because he'd never understood the system in the first place. And I kept my face perfectly neutral through all of it, the same way I'd kept my face neutral during every meeting where someone had undervalued my work for the past 6 years. The following Monday, I submitted my formal transition documentation, 64 pages of procedures, policies, and reference materials that looked impressively thorough and were almost completely useless without the contextual understanding of how to apply them. Then I sent an email to my team members, the engineers who'd reported to me, with a subject line that read "Personal Note. Team, thank you for 6 years of incredible work. You built something remarkable, and I'm proud of what we accomplished together. As you move forward under new leadership, remember that quality isn't just about catching errors, it's about understanding systems well enough to prevent them from occurring. Trust your judgment, document everything, and never let anyone convince you that precision is overthinking. Sharon. Then I did something that would have seemed insane to anyone watching. I started taking lunch breaks. Long ones. I left work at exactly 5 p.m. I stopped responding to emails after hours. I became, in Garrett's own words, a strategic advisor who thought about things instead of doing them. And on Wednesday evening, exactly 9 days after the reassignment, I logged into my personal system at home and changed a single setting in the quality monitoring dashboard's configuration. The system had always operated in 2 modes: enforcement mode, where it automatically blocked deployments that failed validation checks, and advisory mode, where it simply reported issues but allowed deployments to proceed. I'd always run it in enforcement mode. The system that Ian and his team were now looking at? I switched it to advisory mode with one checkbox. To them, it looked exactly the same. They'd see the same dashboard, the same alerts, the same warnings. But the automatic safeguards that had prevented bad code from reaching production for 6 years? Those were gone. The system would still scream about problems, but it wouldn't stop anyone from deploying anyway. I made the change at 7:43 p.m. on a Wednesday. Then I closed my laptop, made myself dinner, and went to bed. Thursday morning came. Friday passed. The following Monday, I arrived at work, made coffee, and settled into my desk with the same calm I'd maintained for 2 weeks. Around 10:30 a.m., the first notification pinged on my phone, an automated alert from the monitoring system, still connected to my personal email as the original administrator. It was warning about a validation failure in the shipping cost calculator module. Severity: high. Recommended action: block deployment pending investigation. I checked the public deployment log. The code had been pushed to production anyway. By noon, there were 4 more alerts. By end of day Tuesday, there were 18. I watched them accumulate like snow before an avalanche, each one documenting a problem that the automated system had correctly identified and that Ian's team had presumably seen and either misunderstood or dismissed as unimportant. Wednesday morning, the first client complaint hit our support queue. A mid-sized retailer was reporting discrepancies between quoted shipping costs and actual charges. By Wednesday afternoon, 3 more clients had opened tickets with similar issues. By Thursday morning, our support queue had 37 active quality-related complaints. Ian sent me a message Thursday afternoon, "Sharon, can you look at the QA dashboard? We're getting some weird readings and I'm not sure how to interpret them." I responded exactly the way a strategic advisor should. The documentation I provided covers standard interpretation procedures. Section 4.2 specifically addresses alert classification. Let me know if you need clarification on any specific procedural item. He didn't ask again. Friday morning at 9:15 a.m., Garrett barged into my office. His face was red, his voice loud enough that people in the hallway stopped to listen. "Why are we drowning in errors? What the hell happened to our quality system?" I looked up from my computer, where I'd been reviewing a process improvement proposal I'd been asked to draft. I took a slow breath, set my hands flat on my desk, and met his eyes with absolute calm. "I'm not responsible for quality operations anymore, Garrett. You reassigned that function to Ian's team on April 15th. I transitioned all documentation as requested. Don't give me that bureaucratic nonsense. You know how this system works. Why didn't you warn us there was a problem?" I pulled up my email archive and turned my screen toward him. I sent 73 emails over the past 2 weeks flagging potential issues with the transition. You marked them all as read but never responded. Would you like me to forward them to you again? That was technically true. I'd sent detailed procedural questions and scenario analyses that implied risks without explicitly stating them, the kind of thing a strategic advisor would produce. He'd ignored all of them because they looked like the overthinking he'd accused me of. His jaw clenched. "This is your system. Fix it. I don't have operational authority over quality assurance anymore. You removed me from that role. I'm giving you back the authority. Consider yourself reinstated, effective immediately." I shook my head slowly. "That's not how this works, Garrett. My transition to a strategic advisory role was formalized in writing with HR. Reversing it would require renegotiating my contract terms. I'm not interested in going back to a position you clearly consider unnecessary." His voice dropped to a hiss. "You did this on purpose." I kept my expression neutral. "I did exactly what you asked me to do. I transitioned my responsibilities to Ian's team and shifted to an advisory role focused on documentation and process recommendations. If the transition hasn't gone smoothly, perhaps that suggests the role was more complex than you assumed." He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him cycling through options, yelling more, threatening me, trying to force me back into operational mode. But he was smart enough to realize that we were having this conversation in an open office space where at least a dozen people had heard him screaming at me, and that any further escalation would only make him look worse. He turned and walked out without another word. By that evening, the error count in our production systems had reached critical levels. Our largest client, a pharmaceutical distributor handling controlled substances, had suspended their account pending an investigation into why their shipment tracking data showed packages being delivered to addresses that didn't match their orders. Legal was fielding calls from 3 other clients threatening breach of contract claims. The support team was working mandatory overtime trying to process complaints they didn't have the technical background to resolve. Monday morning, I received a calendar invitation for an emergency executive meeting at 10 a.m. Attendees: CEO Barbara Yates, CFO Raymond Chu, General Counsel Heather Lansing, Garrett, Ian, and me. No agenda listed, but I knew exactly what it would be about. I arrived 5 minutes early. Everyone else was already there, which told me they'd been talking before I walked in. I took a seat at the conference table and waited. Barbara started. She was in her mid-50s, a former engineer who'd founded Bayside 22 years ago and still owned controlling interest in the company. She looked exhausted. "Sharon, I'm going to be direct. We have a crisis. 17 clients have formally complained about quality issues in the past week. Our largest client has suspended their contract. We're facing potential legal action from at least 4 companies. I need to understand what happened and how we fix it." I opened my tablet and pulled up a document I'd prepared over the weekend, a timeline showing every decision point in the transition, every warning I'd sent, every procedural gap I'd identified in writing and had been ignored. On April 15, Garrett reassigned operational quality assurance to Ian's team. I provided a complete procedural handoff and flagged several risks in writing, including the need for specialized training, the importance of understanding system architecture beyond surface-level dashboard monitoring, and the specific client contracts that included quality penalties. None of those recommendations were implemented. Ian's team is excellent at their core responsibilities, but they weren't given the support or training necessary to manage a specialized function outside their expertise. Garrett jumped in. "That's a convenient narrative, but it doesn't explain why you couldn't have prevented this. You had access to the systems. You could have spoken up more forcefully." I turned to face him. "I spoke up 73 times in writing. You want to talk about the system? Let's talk about the system." I pulled up the technical documentation on the projection screen. The quality monitoring dashboard operates in 2 modes: enforcement mode, which automatically blocks problematic deployments, and advisory mode, which reports issues but allows them to proceed. For 6 years, I ran it in enforcement mode. When I transitioned operational control to Ian's team, I switched it to advisory mode because enforcing blocks without operational authority to make deployment decisions would create organizational chaos. Ian's team would see blocks but wouldn't have the context to determine whether they were false positives or genuine risks. Barbara leaned forward. "Why wasn't this explained during the transition?" It was. Section 7.4 of the transition documentation, page 38. I sent a follow-up email on April 23 specifically highlighting that the system was now in advisory mode and that Ian's team would need to manually review and act on alerts instead of relying on automatic enforcement. I flagged this as a critical change requiring immediate attention. I pulled up the email. Sent to Garrett, Ian, and the DevOps distribution list. Read receipts showed Garrett had opened it for 11 seconds. Raymond, the CFO, spoke for the first time. "What's the financial exposure here?" I switched to a spreadsheet I'd prepared. Client contracts include quality thresholds. Errors above those thresholds trigger penalty clauses. Based on documented errors over the past week, we're looking at approximately $260,000 in contractual penalties, assuming we resolve the issues immediately and no additional problems emerge. If the pharmaceutical client terminates their contract instead of just suspending it, that's an additional $1.2 million in lost annual revenue. That's the direct cost. The indirect cost, reputation damage, difficulty winning new clients, increased insurance premiums, is harder to quantify but substantial. Barbara's face had gone very still. "And how do we fix this? What do we need?" This was the moment I'd been working toward for 2 weeks. I kept my voice calm and factual. Full restoration of quality protocols under centralized control. The monitoring system needs to be switched back to enforcement mode with manual override authority for edge cases. All pending deployments need to be rolled back and re-audited against current quality standards. Client data needs to be manually reviewed to identify and correct all errors that occurred during the transition period. That's approximately 40,000 transaction records across 19 client accounts. "How long?" Barbara asked. "With my current team structure, meaning me in an advisory role, probably 6 weeks minimum, working overtime. With proper operational authority and my former team restored? 2 weeks, maybe 3. Garrett tried to salvage something. "We can bring in contractors to handle the bulk work. Sharon can provide oversight in her advisory role." I shook my head. Contractors would need 3 weeks of training just to understand our client-specific configurations. We'd spend more time teaching them than doing the work ourselves. And I'm not providing operational oversight without operational authority. I'm not going to be responsible for execution while someone else makes the decisions. Heather, the general counsel, spoke quietly. What would it take to get you back in an operational role? I'd prepared for this question. I pulled up a document on my tablet, a contract amendment I'd drafted over the weekend with help from an employment attorney I'd consulted Friday afternoon. Restoration to my previous role as Senior Quality Assurance Architect with operational authority and final decision-making power over all quality-related deployments. Salary adjustment to reflect market rate for this role at companies of comparable size, that's 32% above my current compensation based on recent industry surveys. Reporting structure changed so I report directly to the CFO instead of through operations, to prevent future attempts to subordinate quality concerns to efficiency metrics. And a contractual guarantee that the quality assurance function remains independent for a minimum of 3 years, with any future reorganization requiring board approval. The room went silent. Garrett looked like he'd been slapped. Raymond studied the numbers on his tablet. That's a significant increase. It's less than the penalty clauses we're facing this month alone, and substantially less than the revenue risk if we lose the pharmaceutical client. The independence requirement is non-negotiable. I will not agree to work under a structure where someone can unilaterally dismantle operational safeguards because they look expensive on a budget sheet. Barbara looked at Garrett. Leave us. He started to protest, then saw her expression and walked out. Ian followed him, looking relieved to escape. Barbara turned back to me. This is about more than just fixing the immediate crisis, isn't it? Yes, I said simply. This is about recognizing that quality assurance is infrastructure, not overhead. You don't save money by removing load-bearing walls. You create catastrophic risk. I've been treating quality like infrastructure for 6 years, and it's the reason you've been able to win contracts that competitors couldn't. Garrett saw it as a cost center because he doesn't understand the difference between cost and investment. If you want infrastructure that works, you need someone who understands that difference in a position to protect it. Raymond and Barbara exchanged a look that I couldn't quite read. Then Barbara nodded. Draft the formal contract amendment. We'll have HR and legal review it today. If the terms are as you've outlined and don't create other complications, you'll have your answer by end of business. But Sharon, we need the system fixed immediately. Lives are at stake with the pharmaceutical client, not just money. I know, I said. That's why I'm willing to come back. But only under terms that prevent this from happening again. The meeting ended. I went back to my desk and started working on the restoration plan, because whatever Barbara decided, the problems needed solving. But I didn't touch the system controls yet. Not until the contract was signed. The contract amendment came through at 4:47 p.m. Legal had made minor language adjustments but left all my substantive terms intact. I signed it electronically, then logged into the monitoring system and switched it back to enforcement mode. The effect was immediate. 7 deployments that Ian's team had queued up were automatically blocked with detailed explanations of why they'd failed validation. I spent that evening and the next 2 days working through the backlog of errors, systematically identifying, documenting, and correcting each issue. My former team members, who'd been reassigned to Ian's supervision, were quietly transferred back to my department. We worked 12-hour days for the next week, but we did it as a unit that understood exactly what we were doing and why it mattered. The pharmaceutical client agreed to reinstate their contract after I personally walked their technical team through every error we'd found, every correction we'd made, and the structural changes we'd implemented to prevent recurrence. The penalty clauses still hit us, contracts are contracts, but Barbara paid them without argument. Garrett resigned 6 weeks later. The official story was that he'd accepted an opportunity elsewhere, but everyone knew he'd been given a choice between resigning and being terminated for cause. His efficiency drive had cost the company more in 6 weeks than my department's budget for an entire year. Ian and I had lunch about a month after everything settled. He apologized for what felt like the 100th time, and I told him again that it wasn't his fault. I should have pushed back harder when Garrett gave me the assignment, he said. I knew I wasn't qualified. You did exactly what most people would do, you trusted that leadership knew what they were doing. The failure wasn't yours. He shook his head. I keep thinking about that meeting where you laid out all the documentation showing you'd warned everyone. How did you stay so calm? I would have been screaming. I considered that. Because I knew the system better than anyone else. I knew what would happen when controls were removed. And I knew that trying to explain consequences to someone who'd already decided you were overthinking things was pointless. So I documented everything, made sure no one could say they weren't warned, and waited for reality to make my argument for me. That's incredibly strategic. And kind of terrifying. I smiled. It's what happens when you care too much about accuracy. 6 months later, Bayside's error rate was back to 0.08%. We'd won 2 major new contracts, both with quality guarantees that our competitors couldn't match. My team had grown from 2 engineers to 5, with budget approval for 3 more positions next quarter. And I reported directly to Raymond, who understood that every dollar invested in my department was insurance against losses that could tank the company. I still have those file boxes in my parents' basement. I still document everything in writing. And I still keep backups of critical files on my personal drives, because I learned years ago that the most dangerous moment is when someone in power decides your expertise is expendable. But I also learned something else, that there's power in understanding systems so thoroughly that you become the system. That precision isn't overthinking, it's survival. And that sometimes the best revenge isn't dramatic or loud. It's just being right, and making sure everyone knows you were right, and building your life on terms that prevent anyone from ever treating your expertise as disposable again. My desk now has a small plaque that one of my engineers gave me as a joke after the crisis ended. It reads, "In God we trust. All others must bring data." I keep it facing forward so anyone who walks into my office sees it immediately. Because I still care too much about accuracy. And I always will.